My brother fired me on a Tuesday morning in March, not in his office, not in private. He did it in front of 4 employees in the warehouse, with a printed termination letter he'd already signed. I'd worked in that business for 23 years. Our father built it. And Richard fired me like I was a stranger he'd caught stealing. The letter said my position was being eliminated due to restructuring. It gave me 2 weeks severance, 2 weeks for 23 years. I stood there holding that paper, and I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked at him and asked why he couldn't have told me in private. He said this was cleaner, professional. Then he walked back to his office and closed the door. That's when I knew he'd been planning it. You don't print a termination letter on company letterhead, sign it, and hand it to your sister in front of witnesses unless you've thought about it. Unless you want her to feel small. Our father started that business 40 years ago. He imported industrial parts, valves, fittings, specialty hardware for manufacturing plants. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. He built relationships with suppliers overseas and customers here in Ohio, and he ran it out of a warehouse on the east side of Cleveland. I remember being 10 years old and Dad letting me come to the warehouse on Saturdays. He'd show me how to inventory the parts, how to match up orders with shipping manifests. Richard never came. He was 5 years younger and more interested in playing baseball with his friends. Dad never pushed him. He'd just look at me and say, "Your brother will find his way when he's ready." Richard did find his way eventually. He started working summers at the warehouse when he was in high school. He was good with people in a way I wasn't. He could charm customers, make them laugh, make them trust him. Dad saw that and encouraged it. By the time Richard graduated from college, Dad had him doing sales, full-time. I came in later, like I said, after my divorce. My ex-husband had been a drinker, the kind who promised to change every Monday and was drunk again by Friday. I spent 15 years trying to fix him before I finally accepted I couldn't. When I left, I had my daughter Rachel to support and no real career to fall back on. Dad didn't hesitate. He created a position for me. Accounts receivable, he called it, but really I did whatever needed doing. I learned the business from the inside out. I knew which suppliers were reliable and which ones would short us on orders. I knew which customers paid on time and which ones needed reminding. I knew the numbers better than anyone, including Dad. When Dad died 6 years ago, he left the business to both of us. 50-50, equal shares. But Richard was already running it by then. He'd been managing operations for almost a decade. He knew the suppliers, the clients, the margins. I did the background work that kept everything running smoothly. Dad made us equal owners because he knew Richard needed balance. Richard was good at sales, at handshakes, at telling people what they wanted to hear. But he didn't like paperwork. He didn't like hard conversations. He didn't like being told no. After Dad died, Richard started changing things. First, it was small. He moved his office to the front of the building, gave himself a bigger desk. He said we needed to project success to impress clients. He bought new furniture, a leather chair that cost $2,000, a conference table we never used. He hired an assistant, a young woman named Crystal, who was 24 and didn't know anything about the business, but laughed at all his jokes. Her official title was office manager, but mostly she answered phones and posted pictures of the warehouse on social media. Richard said we needed to modernize. We needed to have a presence online, needed to look professional. He bought new company polo shirts for everyone. He had business cards redesigned with a logo that cost $3,000. He bought a new truck and put the company logo on it, said it was for client visits. The truck was a fully loaded Ford F-250, leather seats, premium sound system. I asked if we needed something that expensive. He said image mattered. Then he started traveling more, trade shows, supplier meetings, long weekends in Detroit or Pittsburgh that didn't seem to produce any new business. He'd come back with stories about potential clients and big opportunities that never materialized. I didn't say much at first. Richard had always been like this, a little flashy, a little careless with money. But I watched the expenses, I watched the cash flow, and I started to see things that didn't add up. There were invoices for meals that seemed too expensive, a dinner in Columbus that cost $800, hotel rooms in cities where we didn't have clients, a weekend stay in Cincinnati that ran $1,200, payments to a consulting firm I'd never heard of, $5,000 a month for 6 months. When I asked Richard about them, he got defensive. He said I didn't understand how business development worked. He said you had to invest to grow. He said I needed to trust him, but I didn't trust him. Not after I found the credit card statement. It was mixed in with the regular bills one afternoon. I opened it without thinking. It was a company card in Richard's name. There were charges for a jewelry store in Pittsburgh, $2,000, a spa day in Columbus, $600, a weekend at a resort in Florida, 4 nights, $3,200, dinners, flowers, hotel rooms, thousands of dollars. None of it had anything to do with the business. I looked through previous statements. It had been going on for months, maybe longer. I brought it to him on a Friday afternoon. I put the statement on his desk and asked him to explain. He barely looked at it. He said it was business entertainment, client gifts, relationship building. I said we didn't have clients in Florida. He said I wouldn't understand. He said that's how deals got made. You had to wine and dine people. You had to show them a good time. I said this looked personal, not professional. His face changed. He said I was accusing him of something. I said I was asking for clarification. He stood up. He told me he'd been running this business while I was filing papers and answering phones. He said he knew what he was doing. He said if I had a problem with how he spent company money, I could talk to the accountant. I said maybe I would. He leaned across the desk. He said, you know what the accountant will tell you? That I'm the one bringing in revenue, that I'm the one keeping this place running. You're overhead, Margaret. You're an expense. So before you start questioning my spending, maybe you should think about your own value here. I left his office shaking, not because I was scared, because I was angry, and because I realized he'd been thinking about this for a while. He'd been planning how to push me out. The next week, he told me he was restructuring my role. He called me into his office on a Monday morning. Crystal was there, sitting in the corner with a notebook like she was taking minutes. Richard said the company was evolving and we needed to be more efficient. He was bringing in a new office manager, a real one, he said, to handle the administrative work. My hours would be reduced to part-time, 3 days a week instead of 5. My salary would be adjusted accordingly. I said that wasn't what Dad wanted. He said Dad was dead and the business had to adapt. I asked who was going to do my job. He said the new office manager, a woman named Denise who'd worked in corporate logistics. She'd start the following month. I said, you're replacing me. He said, I'm restructuring, there's a difference. I took the part-time hours because I didn't have a choice. My savings were thin. I'd used most of my divorce settlement to help Rachel with college. She was in her junior year at Ohio State studying to be a teacher. I was helping with her rent, her books, her living expenses. I was 54 years old and I hadn't had a job interview in over 20 years. I needed the income. Richard knew that. So I showed up 3 days a week and did the work nobody else wanted to do. I reconciled accounts. I chased down late payments from customers who owed us money. I fixed mistakes that Crystal made because she didn't understand how inventory tracking worked. And I watched Richard spend money like it was his own personal account. He bought new furniture for the lobby, a couch and chairs that cost $6,000. He took clients to expensive dinners and wrote it all off. At least twice a month, there was a charge for $200, $300, sometimes $400 at steakhouses around Cleveland. He hired his friend's son to do marketing, even though we'd never needed marketing before. The kid was 23, fresh out of college. He made a website that nobody looked at and charged us $5,000. Then he convinced Richard we needed to advertise on Facebook. That was another $3,000 a month. I kept notes. I printed copies of invoices, receipts, credit card statements. I kept them in a folder at home, hidden in my closet. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I knew I might need them. Denise started in October. She was 40, efficient, corporate. She looked at the way I'd been organizing files and told me it was outdated. She wanted everything digital. She wanted new systems, new procedures. Within a month, she'd reorganized the entire office. Some of it was better. Some of it was just different. Richard loved her. He said this was exactly what the business needed. Fresh thinking. I asked Denise once if she knew I used to work full-time. She said Richard told her I was part-time. She said she didn't know anything about my history with the company. That's when I realized Richard had rewritten my role in his head. To him, I wasn't someone who'd built this place alongside Dad. I was just part-time help. Someone who came in a few days a week to answer phones. Then Richard started talking about expanding. He called a meeting in December, just him, me, and Denise. He said we needed to grow. We needed to get into new markets, new product lines. He'd been talking to suppliers in China about importing a broader range of products. Not just industrial parts, but tools, equipment, maybe even consumer goods. I said we didn't know anything about consumer goods. He said that's why we'd learn. I said we were barely keeping up with our current expenses. He said I didn't have vision. He said Dad built this business by taking risks. We needed to do the same. I said Dad took calculated risks. This felt like gambling. Denise didn't say anything. She just looked at her notes. Richard said he'd already been talking to banks about financing. We needed capital to expand. He wanted to take out a line of credit against the business, $200,000. I said that was a lot of debt. He said it was an investment. I asked to see the projections. He said he'd have them ready for the bank meeting. We had a meeting with the bank in January. Richard did all the talking. He showed them projections that I'd never seen before, revenue numbers that seemed inflated. He talked about growth markets and expansion opportunities. He was good at it, confident, convincing. The loan officer asked about our current cash position. Richard said it was strong. He said we had consistent revenue and good margins. He didn't mention the credit card debt. He didn't mention the late vendor payments. He didn't mention that we'd bounced a check to one of our suppliers the month before. The bank approved a $200,000 line of credit. Richard signed the papers. He didn't ask for my signature. I was sitting right there and he signed a loan. After the meeting, I asked him about it. He said he didn't need my signature. He was the managing partner. I said I didn't know we had a managing partner. He said it was in the operating agreement Dad set up. I said I'd never seen an operating agreement. He said I should have paid more attention when Dad set things up. I went home that night and tore my house apart looking for paperwork. I went through every file box, every drawer, every folder I had from when Dad died. I found the will. I found the ownership documents from when Dad transferred the business to us. There was no operating agreement. There was no managing partner clause. We were supposed to be equal. Richard had lied. I called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Patricia, who'd helped me with my divorce 8 years earlier. I told her what was happening. I showed her the documents, the credit card statements, the loan papers Richard had signed without me. She listened carefully. She took notes. Then she said I had a case. She said Richard was breaching his fiduciary duty. She said we could file an injunction, force him to give me access to all the books, maybe even dissolve the partnership. She also said it would cost at least $20,000 in legal fees, maybe more if Richard fought it, and he would fight it. I didn't have $20,000. She said she was sorry. She said if my financial situation changed, to call her. I went back to work the next week like nothing had happened. I didn't tell Richard about the lawyer. I didn't say anything at all. I just did my job and watched him run the business into the ground. He used the line of credit to buy inventory we didn't need, pallets of tools and equipment that sat in the warehouse for months. He hired 2 new salespeople who didn't bring in any new business. One of them quit after 3 months. The other one spent most of his time on his phone. Richard leased a second warehouse space, even though the first one was half empty. He said we needed room to grow. Every month, the expenses went up. Every month, the profit went down. I tried to talk to him. I sat in his office one afternoon in March and showed him the numbers. I showed him that we were spending twice what we were bringing in. I showed him that if things didn't change, we'd be insolvent within 6 months. He told me to stop being negative. I said I was being realistic. He said negativity was killing this company. He said I needed to either support him or get out of the way. I said I owned half the company. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, ownership doesn't mean you get to make decisions, Margaret. It just means you get to watch. That's when I started looking for other work. I updated my resume. I hadn't touched it in over 20 years. I looked at job boards, sent out applications, administrative positions, bookkeeping, office management. Most places didn't even call me back. The ones that did said I was overqualified, or they'd gone with someone younger, or someone with more recent experience. I went to 3 interviews in 2 months. The first one was for a bookkeeper position at a dental office. They offered me $12 an hour. That was barely minimum wage. I took it because I thought I might need it. But then they called back and said they'd hired someone else. The second interview was at a property management company. The manager spent the whole time telling me about how demanding the job was, how fast-paced, how I'd need to learn their software quickly. I said I was a fast learner. He said they'd let me know. They never called back. The third interview was at a manufacturing plant on the west side. The HR person looked at my resume and said, so you've been at the same place for 23 years? I said yes. She said, that's a long time. Why are you looking to leave? I didn't know how to answer that. I couldn't say my brother was destroying the business and stealing from me. So I said I was looking for new challenges. She didn't believe me. I could see it on her face. Nobody hired me. I was stuck. And Richard knew it. He started cutting my hours more, down to 2 days a week in May, then 1 day a week in June. He said it was temporary, just until cash flow improved. But cash flow wasn't improving, it was getting worse. I stopped getting paid in October. My paycheck didn't come through on the normal day. I called Richard and he said there was a processing error. He'd fix it next week. Next week came, no paycheck. I went to the warehouse on a Wednesday morning and found him in his office. Crystal was there, organizing files. I asked about my pay. Richard looked annoyed. He said the company was having a temporary cash flow issue. He'd pay me as soon as some receivables came in, maybe 2 weeks. I said that was illegal. He said I could file a complaint if I wanted, but that would probably hurt the business. It might force us into bankruptcy. And if the business failed, we'd both lose everything. He was holding the business hostage, holding my ownership stake hostage. I said, "You're stealing from me." He said, "I'm managing a difficult situation. If you can't understand that, maybe you're not cut out for business." I left before I said something I'd regret. I went home and cried for the first time since Dad died, not because of the money, though I needed it desperately. Rachel had graduated and was student teaching, but she still needed help with rent until she got a full-time position. I had bills piling up. My car needed new tires. My credit card was maxed out. But I cried because my little brother had become someone I didn't recognize. Because he'd looked me in the eye and threatened me. Because I'd spent 23 years of my life building something with my father, and Richard was destroying it to feed his own ego. I got paid 2 weeks later, about half of what I was owed. Richard said it was all he could do right now. He said he'd pay me the rest when he could. He never did. I stopped going to the warehouse after that. There was no point. I wasn't getting paid. I wasn't being included in decisions. I was just a name on a piece of paper that said I owned something I had no control over. I spent November and December looking for any work I could find. I applied to retail jobs. I applied to be a receptionist at a doctor's office. I applied to substitute teach at the local schools. Nothing came through. Rachel asked me at Christmas if I was okay. We were at her apartment, just the two of us. She'd made dinner, spaghetti and salad. Simple, because she knew I was broke. She said I looked tired. She said she was worried about me. I told her I was fine. I didn't tell her about Richard. I didn't tell her about the business. She had her own life to worry about. But she knew something was wrong. She said, "Mum, if you need help." I said I didn't. I said everything would work out. I wasn't sure I believed it. Then in January, I got a text from Crystal. She said Richard needed to see me. She said it was important. I didn't respond. I didn't want to go back there. She texted again the next day. Then she called. She said Richard really needed to speak with me. She made it sound urgent. I drove to the warehouse thinking maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he'd realized how far things had gone. Maybe we could fix this. Maybe he'd finally see that we were family and this was wrong. I walked in and he was standing near the loading dock with 4 employees. They all stopped talking when they saw me. Richard walked over and handed me the letter. I read it twice. Position eliminated. Restructuring. 2-week severance. I looked up at him and said, "You're firing me?" He said, "Your employment is being terminated. You'll still own your shares, but the company no longer requires your services." I said, "You can't fire me. I'm an owner." He said, "I can terminate your employment. The ownership is separate." One of the employees, Tom, who'd worked there for 15 years, looked away. Another one, Danny, stared at the floor. They all knew this was wrong, but nobody said anything. They couldn't. They needed their jobs too. I folded the letter and put it in my purse. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. I said, "I'll be talking to a lawyer." Richard said, "Do what you need to do." I walked out, I got in my car, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to breathe. My chest felt tight. My vision was blurry. I thought I might be having a panic attack. Then I drove home. I called Patricia that afternoon. She said we could fight the termination, but it would be expensive and it might not matter. Richard could claim the company didn't need my services. As long as I still owned shares, I was entitled to distributions, but he could argue there were no profits to distribute, and he'd been setting that up for months with his spending. I asked what my options were. She said I could sue for breach of fiduciary duty. I could try to force a buyout. I could dissolve the partnership. All of it required money I didn't have. She said she'd think about it. She said maybe there was something we were missing. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a bottle of wine and Dad's old files spread out in front of me. I went through everything, the original business formation documents, the lease agreements, the asset inventory, the transfer papers from when he gave us the business. That's when I found it. The property deed. It was in an old accordion folder tucked behind some tax returns from 15 years ago. The warehouse we operated out of wasn't owned by the business. It was owned by Dad personally. And when he died, he didn't leave it to the business. He left it to me, just me. I read the will 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But it was right there, the warehouse property, the land, the building, all of it was mine. Dad had put it in my name alone. There was a note in the margin in his handwriting. Margaret will need security. Richard can take care of himself. The business had been paying rent to Dad while he was alive, $1,500 a month. After he died, Richard had just kept depositing the rent into the business account. He'd never asked who owned the property. He'd never checked. For 6 years, he'd been paying rent into the company account when he should have been paying it to me. I sat there for a long time staring at that deed. Then I started doing math. 6 years, 72 months. At $1,500 a month, that was $108,000 Richard owed me in back rent. Plus, the property had appreciated in value. Industrial real estate in that area had gone up significantly. The current market rate for a similar warehouse was probably closer to $4,000 a month. I sat there until midnight thinking. Then I called Patricia and left her a voicemail. She called me back the next morning. I told her what I'd found. I sent her pictures of the deed, the will, the property records. She was quiet for a minute, then she said, "This changes everything." We spent the next week building a case. Patricia worked with a real estate, an attorney to establish the current market value of the property. We pulled comparable leases in the area. We documented every rent payment Richard had made into the business account instead of to me. Then Patricia drafted a letter. It informed Richard that I was the owner of the property at 4200 Industrial Parkway. It stated that the informal lease arrangement that had existed during Dad's lifetime had expired upon his death. It demanded immediate payment of $108,000 in back rent. And it offered him a new lease, 5-year term, $4,000 per month. Take it or leave it. We sent it certified mail on a Monday morning. Richard called me that afternoon screaming. He said I couldn't do this. He said I was trying to destroy the business. He said Dad would be ashamed of me. I said Dad left me the property for a reason. He said I was being vindictive. He said this was revenge for firing me. I said this had nothing to do with my employment. This was about him paying fair market rent for property I owned. He said he couldn't afford it. I said that wasn't my problem. He said moving the business would cost a fortune. All the equipment, the inventory, the client relationships, it would destroy everything. I said, then I guess you should have thought about that before you fired me in front of the warehouse staff. He hung up on me. 3 days later, I got a call from a lawyer who said he represented Richard and the business. His name was Stephen Marcus. He had a smooth voice, very professional. He said my lease terms were unconscionable. He said I was trying to extort my own brother. He said this was elder abuse. I wasn't elderly. I was 60 years old. But he was reaching for anything. I told him to have Richard call me directly. Richard didn't call. Instead, I got another letter from Stephen Marcus. It threatened legal action. It claimed I was violating my fiduciary duty as a co-owner by trying to harm the business. It said I was acting in bad faith. It said Richard would sue me for damages if I proceeded. Patricia responded within 48 hours. Her letter was beautiful. She pointed out that I had no fiduciary duty as a property owner. I wasn't acting as a co-owner of the business. I was acting as a landlord. She also pointed out that Richard had violated his fiduciary duty to me multiple times over the past 3 years. We had documentation of personal expenses charged to the business. We had proof of unpaid wages. We had evidence of loans taken out without proper authorization. We were prepared to file a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of company funds, and failure to provide owner distributions. Patricia attached copies of the credit card statements I'd saved, the receipts, the loan documents. Richard's lawyer stopped responding after that. 2 weeks went by, then 3. I wondered if Richard was going to try to move the business. Part of me hoped he would. Let him start over somewhere else without Dad's legacy propping him up. But then he called. It was a Thursday evening in April. I was making dinner, just pasta and vegetables, nothing fancy. My phone rang and his name came up. I almost didn't answer, but I did. His voice was different, smaller, tired. He said, "Can we meet?" I said, "We could." We met at a coffee shop near the warehouse. Neutral territory. It was a Saturday morning. The place was half empty. Richard was already there when I arrived. He looked tired. His shirt was wrinkled. He'd gained weight. He didn't make eye contact when I sat down. He asked how I'd been. I said fine. He said he couldn't afford the lease rate I was asking for. I said that was the market rate for industrial space in that area. I'd had it appraised. I could show him the comps. He said the business couldn't survive it. Cash flow was too tight. I said that wasn't my problem. He'd created this situation. He'd spent money recklessly. He'd fired me to avoid accountability. He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "I made mistakes." I said, "Yes, you did." He asked if there was any way we could work something out. I said I was willing to negotiate, but I wanted 3 things. He looked up. First, I wanted to be bought out of my ownership stake. Fair market value calculated by an independent appraiser. I wanted out of this business completely. Second, I wanted back pay for all the wages he'd failed to pay me, with interest. Third, I wanted a formal apology in writing, an admission that he'd violated his fiduciary duty and mismanaged company funds. Something I could show to Rachel to prove that I wasn't crazy, that this had all really happened. If he agreed to all three, I'd give him a lease at the old rate that Dad had charged, $1,500 a month, same as before. If he didn't agree, I'd find another tenant. I'd already had 2 inquiries from businesses looking for warehouse space. He sat there for a long time, stirring his coffee. It had to be cold by then. Then he asked how much I thought the buyout would be. I said probably around $150,000, depending on the appraisal. He said he didn't have that kind of money. I said he could get a loan. He'd gotten one before without telling me, or he could sell assets, or he could pay me over time. I'd accept installments if they were reasonable. He said it would take years. I said I had time. He asked why I was doing this. I looked at him, really looked at him. This was my little brother. I taught him how to ride a bike when he was 6. I'd helped him with his algebra homework. I'd covered for him when he came home drunk in high school and Dad was waiting up. I'd stood next to him at Dad's funeral and held his hand while they lowered the casket. And he'd fired me in front of strangers because it was easier than being honest, because he'd rather humiliate me than admit he'd been stealing. I said, because you thought you could erase me. You thought I was small enough to push out and I'd just go away. But Dad didn't raise me to go away. He raised me to pay attention, and I did. Richard didn't say anything. I finished my coffee and left. It took 6 months to finalize everything. Richard got a loan to buy me out. The appraiser valued my stake at $168,000. It was more than I'd expected. The business still had value, despite everything Richard had done to it. Richard paid me in 3 installments. The first one cleared in June, the second in August, the third in October. He also paid me the back wages he owed, $14,000 plus 8% interest. That was Patricia's idea. She said, if we were going to do this, we were going to do it right. He never wrote the apology. Patricia said we could push for it. We could make it a condition of the lease. But I thought about it for a while and decided I didn't need it. Some things aren't worth the fight. And I didn't need Richard to tell me he was wrong. I already knew. I signed over my ownership shares on a Thursday morning in September. Patricia was there. Richard's lawyer was there. We met at Patricia's office. We signed the papers and shook hands. It felt like a business transaction because that's what it was. There was no emotion in it, no anger, no sadness, no relief, just paperwork and signatures. Richard signed the lease the same day, 5-year term, renewable, $1,500 a month. Same rate Dad had charged. I could have squeezed him for more. I could have insisted on market rate, but I didn't. The point wasn't to destroy him. The point was to make sure he couldn't destroy me. And I'd already won. I am his landlord now. He pays rent on the 15th of every month. Direct deposit into my account. Sometimes he's a day late. I don't charge him late fees. I just mark it down. I keep a spreadsheet just in case I ever need it. We don't talk much anymore. He sends the rent via wire transfer. If there's a maintenance issue with the building, he emails me. I respond within 24 hours. I keep it. Professional. I had the roof repaired last spring. I had the parking lot resurfaced in the fall. I'm a good landlord, better than he deserves, probably. Rachel knows the whole story now. I told her last Christmas. She was angry at Richard, at the situation, at the fact that I'd hidden it from her for so long. She said she would have helped. She said she would have done something. I told her there was nothing she could have done. This was something I had to handle myself. She asked me once if I regret how it all turned out. She said I could have just walked away, found another job, let Richard have the business. I told her I tried to walk away, but walking away isn't the same as disappearing. And I wasn't going to let him make me disappear. I'm 60 years old now. I do bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in the area. I work from home, set my own hours, make decent money. I bought a condo near the lake with part of the buyout money. I have a view of the water. I watch the sunrise most mornings with my coffee. Richard still runs the business. I don't know if he's doing well or barely hanging on. I don't ask. It's not my problem anymore. But every month on the 15th, I get a deposit notification, rent paid, and I think about Dad's note in the margin of that will. Margaret will need security. He knew. Maybe he always knew that Richard would be reckless, that Richard would choose ego over family, that I'd need something solid to stand on when everything else fell apart. Dad gave me that, the ground beneath my feet, the walls around my brother's empire. Richard thought he could fire me from the family business and that would be the end of it. He thought I was just someone who did the books, someone who didn't matter, someone who'd take the humiliation and disappear. But I owned the ground he stood on, and he forgot to check. If this story meant something to you, I'd really appreciate a like. It helps more than you might think. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real stories about family, money, and the things we don't talk about at dinner, you can subscribe. I'd be grateful for the company. What would you have done in my place? I'm curious. Would you have fought back or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments. I read them all.